figure out what he wanted me to talk about. Right. So I'm going to start with a little bit from the abstract then before going on to the lecture. As we watch the streams of refugees fleeing from Syria on our TV screens, it's easy to forget that the political aesthetics of the Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, and initially also in Bahrain and Syria, embodied a peaceful, non-violent opposition to tyrannical regimes. Mobilizing young people, workers, and democrats, the uprisings deployed humor, the carnivalesque, song, and poetry to relay their messages. They packed city squares with huge numbers of bodies, united in a collective effervescence, a marvelous experience of the people as a single egalitarian body. The rebellions aimed for change and succeeded in toppling regimes and increasing pressure on governments to effect reforms, including democratic reforms. So that was the past. At the height of the global uprisings and protests that swept the world in 2011, it seemed as though a new era of truly global citizenship was dawning. Across North Africa and the Middle East, in India, Botswana, Israel, Chile, Spain, Greece, the UK, and the USA, protesters, mainly young men and women, were calling for freedom of expression, justice, equality, transparency, and accountability. They were calling for an end to tyranny and tycoonery, for the removal of corrupt authoritarian regimes, and for a more compassionate state. Most remarkably, the protests appeared to spread contagiously across borders, to infect other protests elsewhere in far-removed countries. They were connected not only through their shared values, like equality and transparency, but through shared aesthetic performative styles of protest. These performative styles, too, traveled across borders, mimetically resembling one another. In particular, the uprisings in North Africa, especially in Egypt, and the hand gestures and protest styles of the Occupy movement in Spain echoed one another and were copied in other protests. This was the case despite the fact that the protests in each country were also local, concerned with a range of specific issues. In the Arab world, with regime change; in India, with corruption; in Spain, Israel, and Greece, with the apparent dismantling of the welfare state and the glaring widening inequalities between rich and poor. In Botswana and Wisconsin, the protests by trade unions called for the right for a living wage. And in the Occupy movement in the US, Canada, and Britain, they mainly demonstrated against the bankers and the hedge fund owners who had caused the global financial crisis, and against corporate greed and more generally. But even though the protests differed, they were local in each country. Nevertheless, several themes and means traveled widely, animating protests transnationally, across borders. In this respect, I want to put it to you, they were about the rights and wrongs of a shared imaginary of global citizenship. It was not simply, as many scholars such as Manuel Castells have noted regarding the spread of these protests, it was not simply that social networks have the capacity to spread transnationally, or the fact that these networks use modern means of communication to aggregate massive numbers of individuals from different diverse backgrounds together into the same physical spaces, as Jeffrey Duras has argued. It is that non-verbal images, music, and bodily gestures too travel between protests, and were incorporated in each location into local vernacular, cultural forms of protest through a process of mixing and hybridization. So it was not simply ideologies that traveled. It was body gestures, performance, hand gestures, all kinds of aesthetic demonstrations. The protests were thus, first of all, embodied, and secondly, intertextual. Protestants used their own bodies in space grammatically, imaginatively, and creatively. And protests also referred to or resembled each other in the very aesthetic form in quite different places. Everywhere protesters occupied public squares, everywhere they used masks, caricatures, and graffiti. Everywhere they had similar chants and hand gestures. The protest and uprising could thus be described as citational, in the sense that they cited each other as they traveled geographically in space, across borders. At the same time, each protest also referred across time to a local specific past, for example, to key national events, to liberation movements, or to forms of traditional culture. They went backwards as well as across borders. They thus fused the present with the past images, tropes, slogans, musical refrains, customs, and images into new contemporary cultural vernaculars of protest. They imitated and reproduced events elsewhere and mixed them with current images in new bricollages and assemblages. These embedded the past or other places, often a subtext of the present. Am I going too fast or is it all right? Okay? In our book, The Political Aesthetics of Global Protest, which is here physically embodied in a book, but is also here, right? We follow Crispin Sarko in arguing that even if not all art is political, politics always has an aesthetic dimension. The building materials for the aesthetics of protest and revolt, we argue, are mined from social, political, and national histories and assembled to subvert the aesthetically embodied, materially constructed edifices of tyrannical, authoritarian, or neoliberal regimes. Peaceful political mobilization and democratic claim-making, lacking the instruments of violence and domination, and that's important. They're peaceful and they don't have instruments of violence. Negate such edifices, such tyrannical edifices, through counter-aesthetic movements of symbolic and experiential solidarity. Political aesthetics is thus particularly important for peaceful mobilization. And I think this is, if anything else, this is the main point of our book. As was evident in the protest movements, rebellions, and revolutions of 2011. For global viewers, the uprisings left lasting images of revolutionary song sung in Tahrir Square in Cairo, or Change Square in Sana'a, of fearless confrontations with armed forces. Today, however, these images have been replaced by images of despair, of ruined cities, and desperate populations fleeing violence, of the return of tyranny and fear. Only Tunisia has escaped this descent into chaos through careful and selfless alliance building. As you know, the Tunisians got the Nobel Prize for Peace this year. My lecture will ask, what was left when the protests died out? How can failure in the aims, sometimes utopian, of the protests be understood and analysed? What impact has the protest had? What is their lasting legacy, if any? Centrally important to the debate is the aftermath of protest, the sediment, memory, and opening up to the future. So what I'm asking is, we had these protests and they were amazing and wonderful and exciting, and full of effervescence. But what was left of them, if anything? And what did they open up to the future? It all started with the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. As protesters first rose up to chant the slogan that became the hallmark of the Arab Spring. The people want the fall of the regime. From Tunisia, the chant spread to Egypt, to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Libya, even to the Sudan, to Syria, and even Jordan and the Lebanon. So everywhere in the Arab world during the protests, the people chanted, people want the fall of the regime. Beyond the Arab world, the chant was picked up in the tent protest in Israel. Hanan Sabia, an Egyptian academic, recalls that on the Friday of Rage in Egypt, as the Imam entered the press, she said, the people arose in unison at the many mosques and squares of Cairo, Alexandria, Suez, Port Said, Mansoura, and many other cities and towns in Egypt to chant one slogan. And she translated it in the slogan, the people want to dismantle the system. But who are the people, she asks, and how are they constituted? As a collective, articulating a revolutionary demand for change. As time went by, this question took on, I suggest, a tragic dimension. Who are the people became a tragic question. But initially, the idea of the people, the experience of togetherness, was exhilarating and revolutionary. It reflected a collective euphoria and a sense of communitas, obliterating the boundaries and divisions among different groups in Egyptian society and in all the other places where these chants were chanted. To be replaced by the enactment of a shared community of suffering and celebration. The spread of protests across the world since 2011 infected people in many different, widely separated countries. It also came at a time to be associated with terrible violence and civil war in some places, most prominently Syria, Yemen, and Libya, a point I will return to later. But it is equally important to recognize that it inaugurated a new generation into mass forms of peaceful people's political participation. Undoubtedly, the rebellions in Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt, epitomized in the giant gatherings at Tahrir Square, became a global symbol of protest against the odds and of courage in the face of brute tyranny. They inspired a series of subsequent rebellions, as in Bahrain, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere in the Arab world. The academic Lila Khatib speaks of traveling images, creating a domino effect, she says, and links these to the rise of the global media and the World Wide Web. She sees this as creating a regional civil society and terrain of resistance. What is equally important to recognize, however, was that huge protests beyond the Arab world also followed. In India, in Israel, in Botswana, in Spain, in Greece, in the USA, Canada and UK, and even more recently in Russia, followed in 2013 spectacularly in Turkey and Brazil. So these protests moved throughout much of the world. In Spain, the indignados filled Spanish city squares. In Botswana, I witnessed almost 100,000 public service trade unionists singing songs of rebellion as they gathered daily for over 2 months under giant marula trees in the capital and in other towns. In Israel, thousands of tents filled city boulevards and parks in a dwelling protest against the unbearable economic burden of spiraling prices. The attack on on the welfare state and what they call tycoonery, the growing inequalities between the small minority of wealthy individuals and the rest, the 99%, as they were done by Wall Street occupiers. In Greece, the 2011 movement encamped for over a month in Syntagma Square in Athens, with rallies of 500,000 people out of a population of 10 million, to protest against austerity measures imposed by the EU. The sense of a shared imaginary of global citizenship across many parts of the world, generated by the global reach of the protest, did not imply a demand for a single global state, but reflected shared cosmopolitan values across different countries. It seemed to be a sign of what Danielle Archibughi has framed optimistically as an endless process of globalizing democracy or democratizing globalization. Archibughi argues that democracy cannot be understood in static terms, and that the move is from local democracy to democratizing the international arena underpinned by treaties, alliances, and binding international conventions. I think you cited. The basic Kantian assumption is thus that democracy within the state favors peace between nations, between states. But what do we mean by democracy? The suspicion of the coercive aspect of democracy was articulated clearly in some of the protests of 2011, especially by anarchists in occupied regions in the USA. This suspicion was one clearly shared by Immanuel Kant in his essay, Perpetual Peace. Kant rejects the idea of a world superstate as being inevitably despotic, he says. A state, Kant says, is a society of men whom no one else has the right to command or dispose except the state itself. He sees nations as organic unities, not to be controlled from above. But, as Kant says, given that a violation of rights in one place is felt throughout the world, he's writing in the 18th century, the idea of a law of world citizenship is no high-flow notion. Hence, if the first trend of the new normative cosmopolitanism advanced by scholars in the late 20th century has been to theorize the democratization of a new international order, as we saw Archibughi does, the second strand is often attributed to Habermas through the revisioning of Kant's Perpetual Peace. Habermas argues that international non-governmental organizations have created an alternative global public sphere of debate and advocacy. Listing UN-sponsored world conferences on global issues which took place in the 1990s, Habermas points to the central role played by non-governmental actors who confront states from within the network of international civil society. Nevertheless, he also recognizes that the possibility of global peace is undercut by international inequalities, leading to civil wars and autocratic regimes in the developing world. The post-Cold War period of ethnic conflict in the former Yugoslavia and Chechnya and several African countries, such as Rwanda, Syria, Nigeria, Congo, DRC, Sudan, Somalia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, and in the Middle East and Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and that apparently unchallengeable, persistent autocratic regimes like Saddam Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, or Bashar al-Assad in the Arab world threaten world peace and expose as hollow claims of international rights, human rights. At the same time, these violations of human rights within countries have led to the end of the so-called Westphalian order. This was a principle agreed upon in Europe in 1648, which established the sacralized, inviolable sovereignty of the nation state. But this inviolability meant that regimes could do anything to their citizens within their own states, their own borders. They could perform genocide, even on the scale of the Holocaust. So after World War II, therefore, this inviolability of national sovereignty was first questioned in international law in the Nuremberg trials, and was challenged by the UN 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Regimes could no longer act with impunity and within their own boundaries. Over time, national boundaries have also been increasingly undermined, of course, by economic globalization and the lowering of trade barriers. In the aftermath of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, issues of rights and accountability within and among states and limitation on state sovereignty increasingly came to dominate international policy. This culminated in the UN resolution known as the Responsibility to Protest, which defined the right of the international community to intervene whenever civilians are threatened with genocide by their own regimes. They're ironic today. According to this newly formulated international principle, states no longer had unconditional sovereignty over their affairs. The move was from humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect. The latter authorizes the use of force if necessary to protect civilians under threat. The responsibility of protest with the resolution was passed to the United Nations in 2006, after a UN World Summit in 2005. In the resolution, the member states formally accepted the responsibility of each state to protect its own population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The resolution warned that if and when any state fails to meet that responsibility, then, according to the principle of the responsibility to protect, the international community, so-called, is responsible for helping to protect people threatened by such crimes. The key decision of the summit was thus that should peaceful means, including diplomatic, humanitarian, and others, be inadequate, and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations, the international community should intervene collectively in a timely and decisive manner. Through the UN Security Council and in accordance with the UN Charter, on a case-by-case basis and in cooperation with regional organizations as appropriate. The resolution was referred to as justifying intervention in Libya in 2011 during the Arab Spring uprising. It was invoked again in relation to the Yemen uprisings in the same year, but it failed to be implemented in Syria in the face of repeated Russian and Chinese vetoes in the Security Council. Despite the fact that the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council has strongly condemned the continued widespread and systematic human rights violations in Syria and demanded that the government immediately cease all violence and protect its people. This shows the limitation of international treaties, even if all members of the UN are signatory to them. The most recent body count in Syria is over 400,000. So, if the UN Human Rights Charter and the more recent responsibility to protect resolution signal the emergence of world citizenship, repeated violations and the inability of the international community to act, in the case most recently of the Syrian regime's persecution and massacre of its own citizens, signal the absence of a truly global citizenship protecting the life and safety of individuals wherever they live. The tragedy, of global citizenship that followed the Arab Spring and other protests was not, however, simply the consequence of geopolitical interests and interventions, such as that of Russia or Iran or China, Syria. It is to be found in the aftermath of the protests themselves in countries like Egypt, even when they seem to usher in a new age of democracy, freedom and human rights. The collapse of democracy in Egypt in particular proved more than anything that utopian cosmopolitan ideals always have to be backed up by real politics. This has been the knowledge providers as well. As Bruce Robbins argues in a book called Cosmopolitics, cosmopolitanism cannot be understood in abstract terms. It reflects the striving for universal ideals and local multiculturalism within a particular social field, in a particular place, at a particular time. This means that to overcome the reactionary forces and remain a cosmopolitan in an intolerant environment required enormous courage and faith. Moreover, cosmopolitanism is not just about individuals who travel. Kwame Anthony Appiah, a philosopher, an American African philosopher, has argued importantly that cosmopolitanism is as much an argument within post-colonial states about citizenship, equal dignity, cultural rights, and the rule of law. So what I'm arguing is that, for example, in Egypt, those people fighting for certain values were cosmopolitan within Egypt, in an argument within Egypt. Appiah speaks of cosmopolitan patriotism, a rooted cosmopolitanism, and proposes that cosmopolitans begin with membership in morally and emotionally significant communities, such as families or ethnic groups, while espousing notions of toleration and openness to the world, the transcendence of difference, and moral responsibility for them. In a wide-reaching critical appreciation of Appiah's foundational text, Richard Webber considers a lack in Appiah's stress on the liberal individual. Public cosmopolitanism is necessarily, Webber argues, a socially collective political project of creating alliances between like-minded individuals and groups. And this became evident in Tunisia, where it was only the capacity of Tunisia to create alliances that forestalled civil war there. He argues that Appiah's holistic optimism, as he calls it, underestimates the painful social and political contradictions and the personal price involved in struggling to be both patriotic and cosmopolitan. After all, Appiah's own father, whom he gives us an example of a rooted cosmopolitanism, spent years in jail under a dictatorial Ghanaian regime. At the height of the Arab Spring, protesters throughout the Arab world joined together in public worship. They included men and women, secular and religious, all together. So here we are. This is Tahrir Square. Everybody praying together. Hard to remember that now. But after the democratically held elections of the Muslim Brotherhood and its leader, Mohammed Morsi, as president, this unity, this time of euphoria, as Dalia Wakhtan has called it in our book, was replaced by a revival of the politics of brutality that were typical of the toppled Mubarak regime. Rather than democracy, the so-called deep state in Egypt reasserted itself and ultimately took over in a military coup that appeared to respond to popular anti-Muslim Brotherhood demand. Wakhtan speaks of the aesthetics of brutality that emerged in Egypt during the period of as she does in the novel. These periods, located, loaded with contradictions and conflicts, paradoxically generated a tremendous outpouring of artistic responses, she said. Through videoed songs of defiance and martyrdom, protesters exposed acts of brutality and death while celebrating dignity and immortality. Graffiti, street performances, and art flourished, Wachtan says, articulating a mockery of humour, in mocking humour that refuses to submit to brute show of force. No doubt secularists in Egypt feared the religious takeover of the state by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood and its president had both won majorities in open and fair election. But in protesting against their own legitimately elected government and parliament, the protesters undermined the very values that had only brought them onto the streets in the first place. The so-called Second Revolution in Egypt shattered the vision and experience of a single unified people. What replaced it was murderous polarization between the so-called secular and religious, with Egyptians killing other Egyptians. Freedom of speech was also obliterated as the army shut down all dissenting media. They followed this by imprisoning thousands of people without trial, without being charged, and without access to lawyers. At the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood's legitimate political party and welfare association were banned and labeled terrorists. The propaganda machine in Egypt has turned out the view that all members of the Muslim Brotherhood are terrorists and have brainwashed large swaths of the population to believe in these lies. There is no recognition of the fact that Muslim Brothers have long renounced violence, and explicitly put their faith in democratic elections. During the movement's short period in power, freedom of speech did flourish. The Morsi may have still used Egypt's security forces on a few occasions to suppress protesters. But even if he appeared not to represent everyone, including the secularists, he was legitimately elected to government, chosen by the majority of voters. He had to contend with the obstructive forces of the deep state that refused to die, including the judiciary, the police, the army, and the Ministry of Home Affairs. And this made his behavior sometimes seem irrational and undemocratic. The simple truth was that while young protesters had embraced cosmopolitan values, they lacked the political organization that could back these values in a world of politics. Cynics in the West, in Western democracies, could have told them what we all know, that we in the West don't always have governments of our own liking. Democracy is a messy compromise in which we have to suffer all kinds of awful right-wing governments, as I know from Britain at the moment, in order to preserve freedom while hoping to win elections on other occasions in the future. Some of the worldwide movements held in 2011 were explicitly against politics. Politics were attractive too. In the Occupy movement in New York City, for example, many of the protesters appealed to anarchist values. They refused to direct their demands to the state. Instead, they enacted during the occupation prefigurations of what they called the just society. Among the sunscreens of the Occupy movement, direct democracy was a particular philosophy that aimed to claim sovereignty by avoiding policy. We see this in the current election in the USA with both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump against politics. Politics is a bad thing. The majority of the uprisings and protest movements seem, however, more explicitly political, directing their demands against the state and its rules, and at the very least seeking to reform the iniquities of the present government. Regime change, freedom, multi-party democracy were the central rallying calls of the Arab Spring. The Second Egyptian revolution highlighted, however, that there were some commonalities that young Egyptian protesters shared with the occupying movement. For these protesters, free and fair elections did not in themselves define democracy, so they didn't accept Morsi. Because they didn't feel that he represented it. They rejected rule by the majority, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi, and demanded participation, recognition, and a share in governing the nation. The sad reality was, however, that the unintended consequences of regime change, democracy, and radical reform have often been unpredictable. The occupying movement seems to have fizzled out everywhere. Occupiers cleared by the police using force, and many now question what they have achieved. Reflecting on the protests and uprising once they were over, what long-term role have they played in the achievement of democracy and social justice? What new forms, political entities and configurations have emerged from this movement thereafter? In fact, both political and anti-political rebellions seem to have fallen short of their aims, at least for the moment. Some protests were simply squashed by the states, as in Botswana or Wisconsin. Against that, however, what has clearly been achieved in all the mass insurrections worldwide from 2010 onwards has been a profound experiential moment of the political. A moment in which the collective fashioning of political subject alongside the individual self-fashioning of political subjectivity emerged historically. This experience massively affected a whole new generation of young people everywhere. But Egypt proves the necessity of political organization. Without political organization, secular protesters fail to win a democratic election. After the army deposed Morsi, apparently with popular support, members of the Muslim Brotherhood took to the streets in peaceful protest. They were unarmed as they prayed together during Ramadan and celebrated Eid on the street, setting up encampments with women and children. These peaceful protesters, who were demanding the reinstatement of democracy, were attacked by the Egyptian security forces with guns and bullets in what can only be described as a massacre. Some massacres live on in the public imagination. Sharpeville in South Africa, Tiananmen Square in China, Srebrenica in Bosnia. To these must now perhaps be added the events of August 2017 in Cairo, at the Rabaa al-Adawiya Square, led by the army and security forces against unarmed Egyptian civilians. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring in Egypt, the contradictions in Egyptian society, as the massacre and other killings after it reflected, are described prominently and ironically by Hanan Sabia in the Egyptian song. We are the people, and you are the people. What moved our hearts never moved yours. God is one, and we have our God, and you have your God. After the massacre and other mass killings that followed it, protesters replaced President Morsi's picture with placards and hand signals of the yellow and four-fingered hand salute, Rabia, signifying the word fourth, which alluded to the square where the massacres took place. This newly invented symbol traveled beyond Egypt to Turkey and elsewhere. The question is, in the killings that have followed, was that time of euphoria finally erased, never to return? Or to put this differently, is global citizenship an unreachable, even foolish dream? As sociologists, anthropologists, and cultural studies scholars, we are experts at understanding the power of myth, memory, and history. At the heart of many of the worldwide uprisings neoliberal policies that allow governments worldwide to divest themselves of their responsibilities for vulnerable citizens. The rebellions protest against the huge pay gap and spectacular political corruption in some countries, often associated with unresponsive and undemocratic regimes. They aim for change, toppling regimes and increasing pressure on governments to effect reforms, including demographic reforms. But what was left when the protests died down? How can failure and aim, sometimes utopian, of protest be understood in our lives? Who were excluded from the protest? What deep social divisions did they paper over? Furthermore, what impact have the protests had? What has been their lasting legacy, if any? Centrally important to the debate is what happened in the aftermath of protests. The sediments left and openings up to the future they may have contained. There is evidence that some changes have occurred recently in the West, but not as many as one would like. As things stand at present, the hopes raised by millions of young protesters and of others who witnessed the protests firsthand or on television seem to be shattered. I want to end this lecture by reflecting on what political aesthetics might mean after the revolution. Our book talks of political aesthetics during the revolution, during the protests. In particular, I want to share with you artwork by Syrian artists, some still in Syria, most elsewhere, in Abu Dhabi or Europe. The exhibitions of their works are very moving. And now we come to this part. First, let us consider Picasso's most famous work, Guernica. Guernica is a powerful political document, political statement, painted as an immediate reaction to the Nazis' devastating bombing of the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. Guernica shows the tragedies of war and the suffering it inflicts on individuals, particularly innocent civilians. The painting has gained a monumental status, becoming a perpetual reminder of the tragedies of war, an anti-war symbol and an embodiment of peace. On completion, Guernica was displayed around the world in a brief tour, becoming famous and widely acclaimed. This tour helped bring the Spanish Civil War to the world's attention. Another artistic reproduction of shocking images of destruction and ruin is Polanski's film, The Pianist, which shows the devastation of Warsaw in World War II. This is yet another example of art imitating life. Of course, television is the most pervasive source of images of destruction and ruthless wars, but artists depict the destruction in images that are uniquely theirs. For example, following the violent uprising in his native Syria, artist Tamam Azam created a rendition of one of the most iconic works of art, Gustav Klimt's The Kiss, to protest the country's suffering, making worldwide headway. Gustav Klimt's The Kiss, protesting the country's suffering, made worldwide headlines. He superimposed an image of love over the war-torn walls of Damascus. The Kiss went viral in 2003, exposing the current state of his homeland and the world. Azam communicates the dire need for restoration of love and peace in his beloved Syria. Another powerful image by Azam shows a destroyed Syrian building being transported by balloons in front of the Twin Towers burning on 9/11. Like The Kiss, it overlays one image over another. Azam, who is based in Dubai, says the work underlines the need for action regarding all acts of terrorism, and ensuring humanitarian disasters, and ensuing humanitarian disasters. DJ Waldy writes about an exhibition of Syrian artists in Orange County, USA, and he says, the photographs and paintings in Seed for Syria are both compelling art and take together an instigator of moral consciousness, just as Abbas Samran intended. But these works also evoke the contentious situation of art in a time and place of work. So these are also images of destruction. I've chosen images of destruction, of urban destruction. Abbas told an Orange County Register reporter, usually when you see anything about Syria on the news, you start to get numb back to it. But there's something about seeing the canvas, the texture of the oil paint that makes a Syrian person's pain more real. Can that be true? Does art realize the pain of others more fully than TV images? The situation of war photography is perhaps less complicated. From the Crimean War, the first war to be photographed, to Samran's tragic images of Aleppo and Idlib from 2011, to the front pages of Los Angeles Times, the photographic image of war has been refined into a pervasive aesthetics. We are too practiced at reading wartime photography. So here's one image. This was at the front of one of these exhibitions. And here's another one. Fadi Haddad, for the refugee supporting group Mosaic Syria, estimated it has cost almost £30,000 to smuggle out work for a new Syrian exhibition in London that explores the worsening humanitarian crisis. The 24-year-old artist Safi al-Din Abdel al-Rashid has been using quotes by the Egyptian president to draw cartoons of Abdel Fattah Sisi, which have often triggered funny memes on social media and attached them to variations of the president's face. These totally unofficial emojis only currently exist as images online. In one smiley of Sisi, the caption is, "Do you not know that you are the light of my eyes, or what?" says flirty Sisi. In another, the face depicts an outburst by the Egyptian president in which he angrily utters, "This is not right," in response to the media's criticism of his performance. Okay, so to conclude, so what are we to say about political aesthetics, art and politics, at a time of total devastation and despair, as millions of refugees are fleeing their homes, dying in the Mediterranean, even starving to death, and all in front of our television screens? What is gained by seeing these images through the eyes of artists, poets, or musicians? Does their work stand the test of time? Will it remain as a testament, as we saw with Guernica, when and if we return to a semblance of normality? I'm asking you, the audience, to reflect on this question. What do you think?